guys, welcome to another episode of Textory. Today we are time traveling to 16th century England. So make yourself a cup of tea or coffee and let's jump into it. You know, with a lot of figures from the past, I try to understand sort of where they were coming from. Like, I'm trying to remember their upbringing, the society that they lived in. I'm trying to remember the beliefs of the era that they were raised in, how far behind the science and the medicine was at the time. I always take all those things into account before I judge someone according to modern standards, but not gonna lie, some of these male writers are just asking for it. They're just so difficult to justify and to treat seriously. So today we're reading a bunch of thoughts and prayers, literally, from Philip Stubbes, who was an Elizabethan pamphleteer. First of all, he married a 16-year-old girl, being himself the ripe 35 years of age. And that in itself is like, okay, it was socially acceptable at the time, but also not many people did it. It was much more common to marry in your 20s as a woman. So I'm a little like, okay, Philip, but why? And yes, maybe he did admire her very much, and he wrote his famous work, A Crystal Glass for Christian Women, which was basically a memorial for her when she passed away at the age of 19. But come on. My only satisfaction is that her Wikipedia page is so much longer than his, but it's mostly because he wrote about her. Now, if there is anyone in history that had holier-than-thou attitude, this man was basically that person. He wrote a bunch of pamphlets, the most famous one being Anatomy of Abuses from 1583. And this book was basically a criticism of everything and anything that he saw around him that he didn't like. This was just like a bitching book. And this man was so miserable that I think the only reason that the book was successful as it was that everyone found something in the book that they agreed with, because he criticized so many things about the English society. It was just difficult not to find one thing that you also find annoying. On top of that, in his Anatomy of Abuses, which was already just like a really long diss on the English society, he does not even own up to his views. He's not like, oh, I find this an awful part of society, I think we should get rid of this. No, he never says that. Instead, the whole book is pretending to be a dialogue between Philoponus, who is a traveler, and Studius, who is like a simple guy. And they walk through the foreign country of England and they just criticize everything that English people do. So he couldn't even own up to it. It was a common literary figure at the time to just pretend that it's someone else's thoughts and make it into a dialogue, but come on. And apart from his wife, he loathed women. Like, he loathed men too, to be fair, but he had a particular beef with women. He considered them lazy, he considered them impure, vain, stupid. It's like he had a vision of what a perfect woman should look like, and because women did not fit that criteria, it just pissed him off really badly. And one thing that he hated more than women was fashion. This man just despised having a good time. Fashion in his eyes was a spawn of the devil, and literally any fashion item that looked good would be an object of his scrutiny. Like, if people just wore rags, he would be 100% satisfied. What he didn't probably take into account is that, ironically, his descriptions of all those vile fashions that he detested so much are so detailed that they are an absolute goldmine for anyone that's ever been interested in fashion history, especially in the 16th century. So researchers nowadays use his book that was trying to prevent people following those fashions to recreate and restore what we know about 16th century fashion, which I think is so hilarious. And generally speaking, that text remains sociologically one of the best sources of information about the customs and the daily life of that era. So basically today, we are reading his thoughts mostly on women's fashion in England in the 16th century, and he had a lot to say, so let's just dive into it. So whenever there is a question and answer, it's the Studius asking the question and the Philoponus answering it. How is pride of apparel committed? by wearing of apparel more gorgeous, sumptuous, and precious than our state, calling, or condition of life requires, whereby we are puffed up into pride and enforced to think of ourselves more than we ought, being but vile earth and miserable sinners. And this sin of apparel, as I have said before, hurts more than the other two. For the sin of the heart hurts none but the author in whom it breathes, so long as it bursts not forth into exterior action. And the pride of the mouth, which consists, as I have said, in ostenting and bragging of some singular virtue, either in himself or some other of his kindred, and which he arrogates to himself by hereditary possession or lineal descent, though it be mere ungodly in its own nature, yet it is not permanent, for words fly into the air, not leaving any print or character behind them to offend the eyes. But this sin of excess of apparel remains as an example of evil before our eyes, and as a provocative to sin, as experience daily shows. In very decorative way, he's saying that the sin of wearing clothing that basically slaps too well, like the clothing that looks too good, is the biggest sin of them all. Well, not really, but he's saying like in all types of pride that there is, the pride in wearing ostentatious clothing is worse because you can see it from the outside and if it affects your environment in a way. Would you not have men to observe a decency, a comeliness, and a decorum in their usual attire? Does not the word of God command us to do all things decenter et secundum ordinem civilem, decently and after a civil manner? I would wish that a decency, a comely order, and as you say, a decorum were observed, as well in attire as in all things else. But would God the contrary were not true. For most of our novel inventions and new-fangled fashions rather deform us than adorn us, disguise us than become us, making us rather to resemble savage beasts and stern monsters than continent, sober, and chaste Christians. I told you, he has a beef with fashion. He thinks that fashion deforms people, which, to be fair, in 16th century, fashion was very structured, so I see what he means. But like, just let people live. Just let them look good. Has this contagious infection of pride in apparel infected and poisoned any other country beside Anglia, suppose you? So a lot of the times in this book, he suggests that nowhere else are things as bad as in England, which, my dude, have you ever stepped your foot outside the country? Because 16th century England, I'm assuming things were probably bad, but you're not that special. No doubt, but this poison has shed forth its influence and poured forth his stinking dredges over all the face of the earth. But yet I am sure that there is not any people under the zodiac of heaven, how clownish, rural, or brutish soever, that is so poisoned with this arsenic of pride, or has drunk so deep of the dredges of this cup as Anglia has. With grief of conscience I speak it, with sorrow I see it, and with tears I lament it. It is manifest that all other nations under the sun, how strange, how new, how fine, or how comely soever they think their fashions to be, when they be compared with the diverse fashions and sundry forms of apparel in Anglia, are most unhandsome, brutish, and monstrous. And hereby it appears that no people in the world is so curious in the newfangles as they of Anglia be. But grant it were so, and admit that others excelled them, which is false, shall we do evil because they do so? Shall their wickedness excuse us of sin, if we commit the like and worse? Shall not the soul that sins die? Wherefore let us not sin of presumption with the multitude, because they do so, lest we be plagued with them because we do the like. Moreover, those countries are rich and wealthy of themselves, abounding with all kind of precious ornaments and rich attire, as silks, velvets, satins, damasks, sarcenet, taffeta, chamlet, and such like, for all these are made in those foreign countries. And therefore, if they wear them, they are not much to be blamed, as not having any other kind of clothing to cover themselves withal. So if we would content ourselves with such kind of attire as our own country does minister unto us, it were much tolerable. So he's saying it's not France's fault that they look so good, because they produce the silks, so they are allowed to wear it. But we are so surprised in pride that if it come not from beyond the seas, it is not worth a straw. And thus, we impoverish ourselves in buying their trifling merchandises more pleasant than necessary, and enrich them who rather laugh at us in their sleeves than otherwise, to see our great folly in affecting of trifles, and departing with good merchandises for it. And how little they esteem of silks, velvets, satins, damasks, and such like, we may easily see in that they sell them to us for wools, frizzes, rugs, and the like, which they could never do if they esteemed of them as much as we do. So yeah, that's how business works, my guys. Some people have stuff that you don't, and you just swap. So that you see they are forced of necessity to wear such rich attire, wanting other things, whereof we have store, to invest themselves withal. But who sees not, except wilfully blind, that no necessity compels us to wear them, having abundance of other things to attire ourselves with, both handsomer, warmer, and as comely as they are in every respect. But far-fetched and dear-bought is good for ladies, they say. So he's like, you have really coarse wool in your market, why don't you just wear that instead of the nice silks? Because let's support local businesses. No, that's not at all what he's saying, but he's basically even having an issue with importing goods. Do you think it not permitted to any, having store of other necessary clothing, to wear silks, velvets, taffetas, and other such rich attire, of what calling soever they be of? I doubt not, but it is lawful for the potestates, the nobility, the gentry, yeomanry, and for every private subject else, to wear attire every one in his degree, according as his calling and condition of life requires. Yet a mean is to be kept, for omne extremum vertitur in vitium. Every extreme is turned into vice. Bless your heart for including translations, Mr. Stubbs, because I would be so lost. The nobility, though they have store of other attire, and the gentry, no doubt, may use a rich and precious kind of apparel in the fear of God, to ennoble, garnish, and set forth their births, dignities, functions, and callings. But for no other respect, they may not in any manner of wise. Whatever the that means. The magistrates also and officers in the real public, by what title soever they be called, according to their abilities, may wear, if the prince or superintendent do godly command, costly ornaments and rich attire, to dignify their callings and to demonstrate and shew forth the excellency and worthiness of their offices and functions, thereby to strike a terror and fear into the hearts of the people to offend against the majesty of their callings. And as for the private subjects, it is not at any hand lawful that they should wear silks, velvets, satins, damasks, gold, silver, and what they list, though they be never so able to maintain it, except they, being in some kind of office in the Commonwealth, do use it for the dignifying and ennobling of the same. One big thing around that time in England was sumptuary laws, so people had massive issues if you dressed above your state, or basically if you dressed inappropriately to what your position in society was, what your job description was. They were very particular about that. You could basically get fined for dressing too well. That's the deal. And clearly this guy loved his sumptuary laws, and he did find it offensive when someone dressed like someone else. So this whole paragraph is definitely about like not dressing above your state, even though he mentions that the peasants probably can't afford it anyway, but if they could, they shouldn't wear it. But now there is such a confused mingle-mangle of apparel in Anglia, and such preposterous excess thereof, as everyone is permitted to flaunt it out in what apparel he lusts himself, or can get by any kind of means. So that it is very hard to know who is noble, who is worshipful, who is a gentleman, who is not. For you shall have those which are neither of the nobility, gentility, or yeomanry, no, nor yet any magistrate or officer in the Commonwealth, go daily in silks, velvets, satins, damasks, taffetas, and such like, notwithstanding that they be both base by birth, mean by estate, and servile by calling. This is a great confusion and a general disorder. God be merciful unto us. So clearly he was like, you can't even tell the nobles from the peasants these days. It's getting ridiculous. And a big part of the ladder of society at that point was that you could look at a person and not only could you tell exactly how rich they were, what position they had in society, what was their job, how close they were to the royals in the country. You could also usually tell where they come from. Some cities in Europe even had their own fashion, so you could like tell straight away. So the clothing that you chose to wear was basically like your ID. So what he's saying is everyone dresses above their state these days. Everyone wears what they shouldn't wear, and it just gets him confused. But you could just probably ask, I don't know, is that too bold of an idea? Spudius, the simple guy, is asking legit questions, because this guy is like, if it not be lawful for everyone to wear silks, velvets, satins, damasks, taffetas, gold, silver, precious stones, and whatnot, wherefore did the Lord make and ordain them? That's a good point. If he is so much into whatever is natural to society, why wouldn't you wear God's beautiful creations? And the answer is, I deny not, but they may be worn of them who want other things to clothe them withal, or of the nobility, gentility, or magistery, for the causes above said, but not of every proud fixnet indifferently, that has store of other attire enough. And yet did not the Lord ordain these rich ornaments and gorgeous vestments to be worn of all men, or of any, so much as to garnish, beautify, and set forth the majesty and glory of this his earthly kingdom. For as cloth of gold, tapestry, and such other rich ornaments, pendices and hangings in a house or estate, serve not only to manual uses and servile occupations, but also to decorate, to beautify, and become the house, and to show the rich estate and glory of the owner. So these rich ornaments and sumptuous vestments of the earthly territory of this world do not only serve to be worn of them, to whom it does appertain as before, but also to show forth the power, wealth, dignity, riches, and glory of the God, the author of all goodness. And here in the providence and mercy of God appears most plainly, for where there is store of other clothing, there has he given less store of silks, velvets, satins, damasks, and such like. And where there is plenty of them, there is no clothing else almost. And thus the Lord did deal, for that every country ought to content themselves with their own kind of attire, except necessity enforce the contrary, for that we are to use our liberty in the fear of God. I don't get his argument. Like, he's saying that if a country is like predispositioned to produce silks, that means they should just wear silks. But what if they had to produce something because they just couldn't produce something else? He's not even taking into account political reasons for why people use different types of fabrics. Like in 18th century, Britain did not really get along with France, obviously. So British people started using more and more cotton because they didn't really want to use French silks. So it's things like that that he completely ignores. And he's like, yeah, if you only have leather, you should just wear leather. What's wrong with that? But they say they please God rather than offend him in wearing this gorgeous attire, for thereby the glory of his workmanship in them does more appear. Besides that, it makes a man to be accepted and esteemed of in every place, whereas otherwise they should be nothing less. And the answer: to think that the Lord our God is delighted in the splendid show of outward apparel, or that it sets forth the glory of his creatures and the majesty of his kingdom, I suppose there is no man, at least no perfect Christian man, so bewitched or assotted. What is your opinion? Did the people of the former world so much esteem of apparel as we do at this present day, without respect had either to sex, kind, order, degree, estate, or calling? And the answer is, no doubt, but in all ages they had their imperfections and faults. For hominis est errare, labi et decipi. It is incident to men to err, to fall, and to be deceived. But notwithstanding, as the wicked have always affected not only pride in apparel, but also all other vices whatsoever, so the chaste, godly, and sober Christians have ever eschewed this excess of apparel, having a special regard to wear such attire as might neither offend the majesty of God, provoke themselves to pride, nor yet offend any of their brethren in any respect. But as I have said, not only the godly have detested and hated this vain superfluid of apparel in all times since the beginning of the world, but also the very panims, the heathen philosophers, who knew not God, though otherwise wise sages and great clerks, have condemned it as a pestiferous evil, in so much as they have writ almost whole volumes against the same, as is to be seen in most of their books yet extant. So he is then bringing like a bunch of examples of other philosophers that had issues with good fashions, basically. He says, Sophocles, seeing one wear gorgeous apparel, said to him, "Thou fool, thy apparel is no ornament to thee, but a manifest show of thy folly." And he brings a bunch of other examples that we're not going to read because we are not discussing ancient party poopers. So the Spudius, the simple guy, is asking even more questions and he wants answers. So he's like, "You have borne me in hand of many and grievous abuses reigning in Anglia. But now, setting apart these ambages and superfluous vagaries, I pray you describe unto me more particularly the sundry abuses in apparel there used, running over by degrees of the whole state thereof, that I may see, as it were, the perfect anatomy of that nation in apparel, which thing I greatly desire to know." It sounds like a student that was written by a teacher. He's like, "Please let me know, please. Okay, I really want to know what they wore. You're so smart." And then he's like, okay, fine, I'll tell you. It's kind of like, "Please don't make me sing, guys. Please don't make..." Okay, I will. "Your request seems both intricate and hard, considering there be tot tante myriades inventonum, so many and so fond fashions and inventions of apparel every day. But yet, lest I might be judged unwilling to show you what pleasure I can, I will essay, pro virili mea omnibus nerulis undique extensis," pardon my Latin, like literally Latin, "with all the might and force I can to satisfy your desire. Wherefore, to begin first with their hats." He is giving a detailed breakdown of everything that they wore. I'm going to read some of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing because he goes into details, baby. Like, you can tell it's interesting considering how much he hated fashion that he was so observant, which makes me think he was actually like a closeted fashion queen, but he just used his knowledge for evil instead. "Sometimes they wear them sharp on the crown, perking up like a sphere, or shaft of a steeple, standing a quarter of a yard above the crown of their heads. Some more, some less, as please the fantasies of their minds. Other some be flat and broad on the crown, like the battlements of a house." Because my knowledge is concentrating on the women's fashion. We're going to skip that description. If you want to read it, Anatomy of Abuses by Philip Stubbes is available online. But we are going to skip to a particular description of the abuses of women's apparel in Anglia. Thus, having given thee a superficial view, or a small taste, but not discovered the 100th part, of the guises of Anglia in men's apparel and of the abuses contained in the same, now with like celerity of matter, impart unto the guise and several abuses of the apparel of women, there used also. Wherefore give attentive ear. Spurius is like, my ears be pressed to hear. And then he says, begin when you will, and truly hearing you shall pleasure me much, for I have greatly desired to know thoroughly the state of that land. And then Philoponus is answering his question, and he says, the Lord our God is a merciful God, and a bountiful rewarder of every one that trusts in him. But yet such is the magnificency and liberality of that gentle sex, that I trust I shall not be unrewarded at their hands, if to be called 1,000 names, to be sufficient guerdon for my pains. I will proceed to my intended purpose. The women of Anglia used to color their faces with certain oils, liquors, unguents, and waters made to that end, whereby they think their beauty is greatly decored. But who sees not that their souls are thereby deformed, and they brought deeper into the displeasure and indignation of the Almighty, at whose voice the earth does tremble, and at whose presence the heavens shall liquefy and melt away? Do they think thus to adulterate the Lord, his workmanship, and to be without offense? Do they not know that he is Zelotipus, a jealous God, and cannot abide any alteration of his works, otherwise than he has commanded? Whereof do they make these waters and other unctions wherewith they besmear their faces, can you tell? So, tale as old as time, a guy having a problem with women using makeup. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna read the next paragraph and he's gonna go like, you know what? Take her swimming on the first date and see how that goes. I am not so skillful in their matters of pride, but I hold this for a maxim, that they are made of many mixtures and sundry compounded simples, both far-fetched and dear-bought, cunningly couched together, and tempered with many goodly condiments and wholesome confections, I warrant you, else you may be sure they would not apply them to their amorous faces for fear of harming or blemishing the same. This is a very interesting point, because when we think Elizabethan era, we think lead. Oh, they used lead, they used arsenic, they used all those toxic ingredients. He is actually making a point that I've been also trying to make. If the cosmetics that they were making back then were actively harming their skin every day, I'm pretty sure they would notice. So he's saying they've all been using pretty high quality ingredients to make into makeup, because otherwise they wouldn't want to put it onto their faces. I'm not saying that makeup back then was not toxic, but I don't think it was the case of like, I use a white foundation once and it just peels off. Then follows the trimming and tricking of their heads in laying out their hair to the show, which of force must be curled, frizzled and crisped, laid out, a world to see, on wreaths and borders from one ear to another. What he is basically describing is all sorts of constructions that women back then used to puff up the top of their hair, or like the front of it. If you look at Elizabethan portraits, there's a lot of hair volume in the front of the hairstyle, and it was achieved by using all sorts of hair rats or constructions like wire. So I think that's what he means when he says it's laid out on borders from one ear to another. And lest it should fall down, it is underpropped with forks, wires, and I cannot tell what, rather like grime stern monsters than chaste Christian matrons. Then on the edges of their bolstered hair, there is laid great wreaths of gold and silver, curiously wrought and cunningly applied to the temples of their heads. But God give them grace to give over these vanities and study to adorn their heads with the incorruptible ornaments of virtue and true godliness. See, I told you, he has a problem with everything. Like, I know, yeah, there probably existed some vain women back then, but is it a crime to look good? Like, be for real, Philip Stubbs. If curling and laying out of their own natural hair were all, which is impious and at no hand lawful, notwithstanding, for it is the ensign of pride and the stern of wantonness to all that behold it, it were the less matter. But they are not simply content with their own hair, but by other hair, dyeing it of what color they list themselves. And if there be any poor women, as now and then we see God does bless them with beauty as well as the rich, that had fair hair, these nice dames will not rest till they have bought it. Or if any children have fair hair, they will entice them into a secret place, and for a penny or two they will cut off their hair. As I heard that one did in the city of Manidno of late. What the f is that city? Okay, it's an old name of some English town that I don't know. Who, meeting a little child with very fair hair, inveigled her into a house, promised her a penny, and so cut off her hair. That's actually wild, because I definitely can see it happening sometimes in extreme cases. But yeah, I totally believe that there was like a massive hair industry back then. I can also easily believe in blonde being the most popular color. Then, on top of these stately turrets, I mean their goodly heads wherein is more vanity than true philosophy now and then, stand there other capital ornaments, as French hood, hat, cap, kercher, and such like, whereof some be of velvet, some of taffeta, some but few of wool, some of this fashion, some of that, and some of this color, some of that, according to the variable fantasies of their serpentine moods. And to such excess it is growing, as every artificer's wife will not stick to go in her hat of velvet every day, every merchant's wife and mean gentlewoman in her French hood, and every poor cottage's daughter in her taffeta hat, or else of wool at least, well lined with silk, velvet, or taffeta. But how they come by this, so they have it, they care not. Who pays for it, they regard not, nor yet what hurt both to themselves and others it does bring. They fear not, but run daily a malo ad peius, as they say, from one mischief to another, until they have filled up the measure of their evil to their own perdition at that day. So here I don't even understand what his problem is. He's just like, there is too big of a variety. You just need one hat. Like, he would probably be happy to just design a single hat for all women to wear, like a single head covering that will be government regulated, and then he wouldn't have to worry about seeing too much of a good stuff. But he also mentions that women of all classes started wearing really expensive headwear. And he's like, yeah, they don't care who buys it. But no, they must have acquired it somehow. So maybe they're just good businesswomen. You hear not the 10th part, for no pen is able to so well to describe it, as the eye is to describe it. The women there use great ruffs and neckerchiefs of Holland, lawn, cambric, and such cloth, as the greatest thread shall not be so big as the least hair that is. Then, lest they should fall down, they are smeared and starched in the devil's liquor. I mean starch. What was his problem? Like, devil's liquor? Really? Starch is bothering you, my dude? After that, dried with great diligence, streaked, patted, and rubbed very nicely, and so applied to their goodly necks, and withal underpropped with sappertaffs, as I told you before, the stately arches of pride. So I'm assuming he's referring to those wire constructions that were helping to keep your ruff up, or not ruff, but a collar. Beyond this all, they have a further fetch, nothing inferior to the rest, as namely 3 or 4 degrees of minor ruffs, placed gradatim, step by step, one beneath another, and all under the master devil ruff. The skirts, then, of these great ruffs are long and wide every way, pleated and crested full curiously. Then last of all, they are either clogged with gold, silver, or silk lace of stately price, wrought all over with needlework, speckled and sparkled here and there with the sun, the moon, the stars, and many other antiquities strange to behold. That actually sounds so good. Like, imagine having your clothes embroidered with gold and it's like sun, moon, stars. Design-wise, immaculate. But to him, it's just other antiquities strange to behold. I think he was like, I know there's a lot of people like that nowadays that just hate anything that's new. They are afraid of everything. Everything is a threat to them. There's a lot of those people in social media. I think, honestly, he would be one of those people nowadays that are just, they hate anything that brings you joy because it's new and it didn't work this way before. Then Spurius drops some wisdom. As in a chameleon are said to be all colors save white. So I think in these people are all things else save virtue and Christian sobriety. Proteus, that monster, could never change himself into so many forms and shapes as these women do. Belike they have made an obligation with hell and are at agreement with the devil, else they would never outrage thus, without either fear of God or respect to their weak brethren, whom hearing they offend. And then Philoponus is like, yeah, it's even worse than that, because the women also there have doublets and jerkins, as men have here, buttoned up the breast and made with wings, welts, and panions on the shoulder points, as men's apparel is for all the world. And though this be a kind of attire appropriate only to men, yet they blush not to wear it. And if they could as well change their sex and put on the kind of men, as they can wear apparel assigned only to men, I think they would as virely become men indeed, as now they degenerate from godly sober women in wearing this wanton lewd kind of attire proper only to men. That also sounds very familiar, that women are dressing like a man in an unbecoming fashion. They look manly, it's unnatural. Nothing has changed. This guy wrote it in what, 1583? And it's still valid nowadays. It's always a little sad when something is still applicable to modern society. It is written in the 22 of Deuteronomy that what man soever wears woman's apparel is accursed, and what woman wears men's apparel is accursed also. Now whether they be within the bands and limits of that curse, let them see to it themselves. Here's what I meant when I said that his descriptions were really detailed. He describes types of fabrics used for female dresses, and then he says, but if the whole gown be not silk or velvet, then the same shall be laid with lace 2 or 3 fingers broad all over the gown, or else the most part. Or if not so, as lace is not fine enough sometimes, then it must be guarded with great guards of velvet, 4 or 6 fingers broad at the least, and edged with costly lace. If you are looking into making a dress from that period, this is basically very detailed information about the decoration used. You even have the width of decoration at the bottom of the skirt. It's insane. And as these gowns be of diverse and sundry colors, so are they of diverse fashions, changing with the moon. For some be of the new fashion, some of the old, some of this fashion, and some of that. Some with sleeves hanging down to their skirts, trailing on the ground, and cast over their shoulders like cowtails. Some have sleeves much shorter, cut up the arm, and pointed with silk ribbons very gallantly. Some have capes reaching down to the midst of their backs, faced with velvet, or else with some fine wrought silk. Then have they petticoats of the best cloth that can be bought, and of the fairest dye that can be made. I just think it's really funny because the fact that he gives so much detail and that we know is correct because we can see the portraits, we have extant clothing, he is not wrong. It just makes me imagine him walking the streets of, I'm assuming, London, and just looking at what women are wearing very angrily and just like making notes. So he would be like, yeah, okay. So they had shorter sleeves and they pointed with silk ribbons. That's disgusting. I'm gonna write this stuff down. But the fact that he observed it so intently, I know he probably just did research for the purpose of the book, but why were you so interested in fashion, my guy? That's a little bit suspicious. I'm just saying, for a Puritan that hated fashion, how did you know what the petticoats look like? But which is more vain of whatsoever their petticoats be, yet must they have kirtles, for so they called them, either of silk, velvet, grosgrain, taffeta, satin, of scarlet, bordered with guards, lace, fringe, and I cannot tell what besides. So that when they have all these goodly robes upon them, women seem to be the smallest part of themselves, not natural women, but artificial women. Not women of flesh and blood, but rather puppets or moments of rags and clothes compact together. And Spurius is like, he's like the biggest hype man. He's like, yeah, you're so right. He's like, their parents and friends are much to be blamed for suffering them to go into such wanton attire. They should not allow them such large pittance, nor suffer them to measure their apparel after their own licentious yards of self-will and wicked desires. So then they go on saying that, oh yeah, it all starts when they're children and they're already allowed too much. Women should be kept short and all that kind of stuff. And then he also even has an issue with people carrying pomanders, you know, those tiny bowls full of herbs and perfume. Is not this a certain sweet pride, to have musk sweet powders, fragrant pomanders, odorous perfumes, and such like, whereof the smell may be felt and perceived, not only all over the house or place where they be present, but also the bed wherein they have laid their delicate bodies, the clothes, and things which they have touched shall smell a week, a month, and more after they be gone. But the prophet Isaiah tells them, instead of their pomanders, musks, balms, sweet odors, and perfumes, they shall have stench and horror in the nethermost hell. Let them take heed to it and amend their wicked lives. What is wicked about smelling good, my dude? You are... Oh my god, he must have been so gross. Okay, we're gonna end this here. What always gets me with these old texts is how soaked they are with religion and antiquity, and how everything in life, you could trace it back to either a Bible quote or a story or an antique character or a historical persona. So a lot of the things, his only arguments are because I have read once something that sounded similar. And it's not even the Bible, it's like quotes of ancient philosophers. There is several moments in this book, a lot of them actually, when he brings all those elements as a proof that he's making a valid point. And I always find it a little incredible to think about, because back then you couldn't really rely on the knowledge we have now. You couldn't rely on science. Some of the things you just did not know why they happened to you. You could only assume, you could only guess. But what other choices did you have? Like, it was either the Bible and ancient philosophers and maybe smart people of your own era, or just magic. Like, if you didn't know where plagues came from, it was, I guess, a natural conclusion that they were a punishment for frivolous fashion, as he says at some point in the beginning. Of course, it sometimes took people to extremes. So his Puritan attitude went way too far. Like, this dude was off the rails. And like, apparently his young wife was so pious that at her deathbed, she confessed that she felt affection towards a puppy and that it was a sin. There was this attitude at the time to forego any sort of pleasure that you get from life. And apparently, I'm guessing Philip Stubbs secretly he liked fashion. I think he liked fashion. I think as much as he criticizes it, the detail that he goes into, to me, it shows a certain fascination. And I think maybe he was kind of torturing himself on purpose to be a good Christian, into pretending he doesn't like it, and into purposefully abandoning fashion. Oh, this is a hot take, but I think he actually wanted to dress nicely, but he just thought it's a sin. Let me know what you think. I think his thoughts on women's fashion, he actually doesn't bring up any solid points. He's mostly like, yeah, they shouldn't wear their hair the way the Lord did not make it. But does he mean like, would he just want them in like rags and with their hair down? Because that was considered sinful as well. So he's just a very extreme example. But at the time, there were a lot of voices like that thought that fashion means vanity and vanity means sin. So basically all women are sinful because they look good. I think it's still a sentiment that is somehow present in our modern society, but obviously not as much. So to see him describe all these things and then he's like, yeah, I wish you end up in hell, by the way, because you smell too good, is a little extreme, like a tiny bit extreme. But yeah. I think that's all I have to say about it. It is very interesting from like a fashion historian point of view because he does go into great detail regarding the fashions, but he also goes on to those really long rants about hell and the devil, and yeah, it's a lot. So that's what Philip Stubbes had to say about 16th century fashion, both men and women. And yeah, you know what? Out of spite, I'm gonna dress good today, just so his ghost is unsatisfied. And I wish you the same. Like, just wear your best clothes today. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll hear you in another one. Bye!